an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, here we go. Look at that. It is the 14th day of November. Busy week here in the province of Ontario with everything that's going on. We had Remembrance Day. We had conversations post-election in the U.S. about free trade. We had the annual Who's Hungry report from our friends at Daily Bread Food Bank, and all fodder for conversation. In this edition of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics Podcast, I'm Dave Trafford. Good of you to join us. Just a few notes. Remember, it's in the show notes. We want to hear from you. So leave us a talkback message. The link is in the show notes, but if you're scribbling it all down right now, it's speakpipe.com/ontheledge. Just hit the microphone icon. Leave us your message. You got 90 seconds, and we'd be happy to include whatever you've got to say in upcoming programs. So that is all good fun and games. I'm telling you, right? So let's get at it right now, and let's get to the crew. Here we go. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics Podcast. Keith Leslie is here, and joining us this morning from Antigonish. How's the, is it chilly down there?
It's cold, wet, and windy. We're getting these 70-kilometer-an-hour gusts from the north. It's chilly, yeah. It's like zero, but it feels bitter.
Yeah, well, we're getting a little bit of that here, but certainly I know you guys tend to get it. Thanks to being closer to the ocean, it gets a little brutal. Tim Hudak had a bit of a winter jacket crisis this morning, given the change in the weather. Good morning. How are you?
I survived. It was a tense household, Dave, this morning to make sure everybody's prepared to see the Taylor Swift concert. So it's going to end well, but it was a bit of a rough start.
Yeah, indeed. And it's always one of those things where, you know, the weather changes. John Wright, and you thought the gloves were in there, but they never are. But John Wright is here. He is our veteran pollster, and we like to think of him as the founding pollster for On the Ledge this morning. So welcome in. And Kathleen Wynne is with us. She is the former Premier of Ontario. And among all the things that we could be talking about this week, and I think maybe it's one of those things that we should probably start with because it lends itself to the political conversation that we had last week. It's not necessarily about politics specifically in Ontario, but I heard you talking about it earlier this week, Kathleen, this whole idea that kids seem to be, you know, ruder, misbehave more often. Maybe the better word is less respectful in terms of how they just approach life, and whether it's adults or other people in their lives.
Well, yeah, as I was saying earlier, it's hard to imagine that kids would be any ruder than when I was in high school. But apparently there was a report done, and it was actually focusing on the aftermath of COVID, Dave, and kids not having been in classrooms, not having been socializing with each other. And I think some of the language used in the report is, they were out of practice in terms of sort of civil behavior in a classroom. And I mean, I totally get that COVID would have had an impact. And so the report made sense to me. I have a daughter who's a teacher, and I think she's experienced some of that. And, I teach university kids who lost a couple of years of high school. I don't really see the impact there. I think it's the little kids who weren't acclimatized to school and have to learn. But the link I was thinking about was, okay, that may be that COVID caused this, but I think that there's one radio host, John Moore, used the term coarsening, a coarsening of the civil conversation or the civic conversation that we've experienced, certainly over my lifetime. And So I just wonder if there's an element of that as well. You know, there are things said, and there's a manner of conversation, whether it's on TV or certainly social media, on the radio, that's just different than it was 35 years ago, 40 years ago. So I wonder if both those things are happening. Respect for institutions, respect for each other. I worry it's breaking down a bit, quite apart from COVID.
Well, John, the part of that is, and it's easy, we can just immediately point to social media first, and the anonymity of the ability to participate in the conversation. I put that in air quotes. For example, here on YouTube, there are people who will comment on the show, and they have, Whiskey 35-2 is their name. I have no idea who they are, but they'll leave some snotty comment that has little or nothing to do with what we've been talking about. But it's been normalized at so many levels. I don't think you put this genie back in the bottle.
Well, probably not for the time being. I agree with what Kathleen said, because COVID has had a big impact, and it goes to a conversation that my wife and I had when we bumped into someone who had looked after our kids at a daycare years ago when we were at the Royal Winter Fair the other night. And there was a discussion that took place, and it was, the friends that we had then have grown up, and our children have grown up, and the children have remained friends because of the setting. And it was kind of like, well, there's a peer issue. They all socialized together. They went through school together. It was a different time. And yet I then look at kids who've gone through the COVID period, and there are some real adaptability issues that have to be taken into account. And secondly, I also agree about the coarsening. But the other conversation that we've had with two teachers over the last couple of weeks has also been about the uncontrollability of certain challenged students in the classroom, mainly because they've been integrated into the classroom without any form of assistance from teachers' assistants. That's been either withdrawn or hasn't been fulfilled to recognize some of these issues. So it was disheartening to hear on two fronts. One is, and we have to remember the report that recently came out about teachers wearing almost body armor, underneath their sweaters to go into their classrooms. There are uncontrollable circumstances that are incredibly distracting and injurious to the teachers that the teacher was telling us about, and they have no help. So I think there's a third category here with, we've got some kids who are challenged, who don't have programs, whose teachers are trying to cope with that, whose parents are trying to cope with that, and it is disruptive. So I think it's a very different time to be in the classroom than it would have been, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I agree, Tim, with Kathleen vis-a-vis. I can't imagine that kids were more buggers today than they were when I was in high school, for sure. I get that. And earlier, before we started, Kathleen had asked, or talked about the kid who climbed out the window to get away from the detention. Present. So, we did those things, but I don't. Oddly enough, I think we still had respect for Sister Eileen from the classroom.
That's what I always say. Bring back the nuns, right? Bring back the nuns. We'll clear this up in a matter of weeks. Holy, Sister Beatrice, I think she's probably 150 years old. She was tiny, and she just gave you that look, Dave, and you straightened up in your chair and shut your mouth right away. Look, I'm going to agree with my colleagues, Kathleen and John here, and then I'm going to add one of my own. I think Premier Wynne is right that there has been a coarsening over time across the board. And I appreciate John's point. I really think that, integrating students with special needs is paramount, right? My own daughter's benefited from that. Sadly, we don't have the resources to support the kids in the classroom, especially the most challenged. Love to see more money diverted in that direction. And I do think we should, if parents can provide additional services themselves, right now they have trouble getting them into the classroom in the school environment. I think we should open the doors for that additionally. Here's the third point. I think there's also been a breakdown of discipline. We were at parent-teacher interviews just a few nights ago, and the teachers did remark that they have seen, this is elementary school, Maitland School, that kids post-COVID, many didn't adapt, so the problems are greater. The other problem teachers talk about, and I agree, is I bet, Dave, Keith, Kathleen, and John, if you got in trouble at school, you got it 4 times as bad when you got back home. Son of 2 teachers here. If I crossed the line, I didn't dare do it again. And I don't think parents are doing enough to back up the teachers, to back up the principal. I think they're taking the other side of the argument, and that's got to be awfully frustrating to our professionals in the classroom.
Yeah, and Keith, Tim's right. I mean, boy, if I had to face mom and dad coming back from, a stern warning from Sister Eileen, that would have been just disastrous for me. So yeah, I learned in a hurry. But even culturally, we have normalized this behavior where it's okay to be a dick.
Well, I suppose we have it, and we Premier Wynne started off by saying it's not really directly tied to politics, but I think it is in a large part because we've seen our political leaders take the rhetoric to levels that we never ever saw before, where you're now not just a political opponent who's wrong, you're the enemy from within. This sort of rhetoric gets to people. And I also want to go back. I think that the pandemic combined with, we almost brushed off social media here. I think the anti-social media combined with the pandemic, where the kids were home and isolated, this was their only way. We've never seen this before. We've never seen kids have this only way to socialize and be together online, as it were, on their phones. And the algorithms, as we know, feed exactly all the wrong behaviors. If you click once or twice on a video that takes you down a bit of a rabbit hole, all of a sudden you're watching videos that are nothing but fighting and rudeness. And, people, and you see them in cruise ships and in schools, everywhere, people just fighting these videos. So I think the social media aspect of it played a huge role, especially with these kids that were home during the pandemic. But with all through society, we saw this. I don't even think, I'd like to say, it started in 2016 when Donald Trump hit the political scene hard. But it actually, as we saw early in the 2000s and 2010s, that newspapers, they didn't know what to do with the comment section, because keyboard warriors were just, to the points made earlier, just so off the cuff, just being rude and over the top and condemning and just not even really addressing ever the points that were made, just wanting to attack somebody online because they feel brave and able to do this. All of this, and the young people, of course, see this. But we saw with newspapers, they tried curating the comment sections. They tried having someone edit them. Then a lot of them just shut them off because people were so crazed in their responses to just basic stories, factual stories. So when we can't agree on even what the facts are, when young people, when kids see the adults behaving like this and calling each other these vicious names and threatening to have them, stood up before firing squads, they just see it in themselves that of course they're going to emulate that behavior. And when you're young and you don't have those social niceties, you can just somewhat lash out. We're going to see kids behaving badly, but we're seeing, I think, a large part of it is because adults are behaving badly in many, many areas.
Yeah.
Two things as we're recording this, the headline flash across CNN this morning is that there's an epic record number of people who are bailing out on X vis-a-vis Twitter this week. And there's a whole bunch of reasons behind it in terms of new terms of use and that kind of thing. But be curious to see what the reaction is once we get people out of that environment. I mean, they're going to have to go somewhere else to vent. But I think the social media part of it is great. The other part of that is as well, once you get into the comments chain, the first comment might be about Keith's story about Kathleen Wynne, but then the next comment is Tim taking on John's comment, and then the two of them just go off on a tangent, right? And it becomes something all by itself and just creates all its own momentum and has nothing to do with the original headline or point or whatever it might be. So they begin to feed on themselves, even within that chain of comment, again, that has nothing to do with the story.
Letters to the editor, which were obviously, edited and printed in newspapers, really were meant to be, a countervoice to the stories and outside opinions that were left out of stories. That's not what's happening now with comment sections. So this is one area where electronic media, electronic newspaper has not made the news industry better. It's made it worse. And again, just adds to all this coarsening, as we discussed, of just our relations with each other.
Yeah. Talking about sort of normalizing things, alluded to the story off the top. The Who's Hungry Report 2024 came out this week, and the staggering number is that 3.49 million visits occurred this year in Toronto alone to food banks. And if you're watching on YouTube, we've got the graph up there, and that one spike, it's like the hockey stick for the last year. And about midway through the graph, the first time we hit 1 million visits in a year was after the financial crisis in 08, 09. It seems as though it kind of jumped up again in 17, but obviously since the pandemic, we have seen extraordinary numbers. And talked to Neil Hetherington this week about it, and God love him. You know, he is a real warrior and committed to the cause. But at some point I said to him, Kathleen, I'm tired of having this conversation with you. You know, and I'm not blaming Neil for it. You know, where does this end? Where does it get to a point where we say this is a solvable problem, and we, through willful ignorance at all levels of government, don't want to do it?
Well, yeah. And, you know, Neil Hetherington and the Daily Food Bank, I mean, they were big supporters of some of the things that our government did, like the basic income pilot, increasing minimum wage. I mean, there are real things that government can do, Dave, to alleviate poverty. I mean, we're talking about poverty reduction. How do we deal with the reality that, and I heard him talking, you know, there are people who are working 2 and 3 jobs. And I think the stat was that the vast majority of the people who are coming to the food bank have degrees, they have education, they may have a job, and still they cannot make ends meet. So part of it is the cost of living crisis that we're in right now. You know, part of it is inflation and the cost of groceries that people are feeling right across the board, especially young families with kids. But I think there's an underlying issue, which is we have a large segment of the population, this population that goes to the food bank, that cannot live on the wages that they are earning. And that is a huge issue. And so we've got to deal with it in terms of corporations making decisions, the kind of work that people have. And I do think that the social assistance structure that's in place, which is why we put a basic income pilot in place. If we'd been reelected in 2018, my hope was that we would have been able to take the evidence from that basic income pilot and figure out how to restructure the social assistance system so that people would be able to have a decent life, make a transition from poverty into the economy, if that's where they were going, or if they were people who never were going to be able to work, and there is a segment of the population for whom that's the case, then they would actually be able to feed themselves and have shelter. So we didn't get to do that, and the federal government did not come in behind us and look at how they might have put a basic income in place. And I don't think they are intending to, although there has been legislation that has been proposed as a private member's bill, and there's been Senate legislation around basic income. So my point is there's a basic poverty issue, and yes, there's an inflation issue, which I think has created the current situation.
Yeah, Tim, you know, when you look at it, there's a real cost to poverty. And we throw this number out all the time, $30 billion a year in Ontario. That's a pre-pandemic number. And, you know, I sometimes people will push back on me and say, well, that's, you know, it's not really the cost because it's spread out over all these other areas and all these pots where the money's coming out. That's what makes it difficult to manage, is that it affects healthcare, it affects justice, it affects education, it affects mental health care, social services, all of these things. And back to the conversation maybe we had a couple of weeks ago about the efficacy of having a homelessness minister. How do we pull all of that together to make it effective and efficient so that we're not pissing away $30 billion a year to support poverty?
We would probably spend the whole podcast on that day. Let me say this off the top if you want to dive into some of the particulars. I mean, hats off to Daily Bread Food Bank and Neil Hetherington for what they've done here. And what groups often do is they'll put out the headline, they'll show the hockey stick chart, which is alarming enough on its own on the growth of dependency in food banks in Ontario. But what they do very effectively is then they offer 2 things: a prescription for how to fix this, and I'll highlight some that I think really popped out of their report, and then a third, a call to action for what people can actually do to help food banks, but also to provoke public policy changes to assist. And 3 of the things that he talked about here, number one, I never thought about this before, maybe folks have, but an automatic tax filing for all Canadians. Because there's so many people of low income who don't file the taxes, don't know of the benefits that are available. So why couldn't that be automatic to make sure they get the support they're entitled to? Because I bet a lot of that does not get through the individuals or families at the end of the day. Number two, I think we've really fallen off momentum when it comes to housing. A lot of good ideas on the table. No doubt higher interest rates have meant fewer projects to move forward, but it feels like, Dave, where the momentum is slowing. And when it comes to, affordable units, waiving development charges altogether, stopping NIMBY forces from taking away this type of housing, that's paramount to help those that are in jeopardy of losing home altogether and then spending so much of their money on shelter costs they can't even afford food. And then third and finally, supporting people on temporary status. Maybe this is wrong for me to say, international students use the food bank. They're here. I guess they need support, but should you have a program that says for international students through the post-secondary institution or friends back at home, they should have an economic floor so they don't have to use food banks in the first place. And then for those that are here on refugee status, you really need a wraparound from you. Shouldn't dump them into the shelter system. You shouldn't dump them into the food banks. There's a responsibility of the national government when you open the doors to make sure they have wraparound support and not take services from others.
Yeah, and to that point, John, when I was talking to Neil this week, he said, one of the good things that the feds have done is they've raised the requirements for international students in terms of the amount of money that they need to have before they can apply and come to Canada now. It used to be something close to $10,000. It's $20,000 now. Okay, but even at that, when you look at the cost of living in Toronto or the GTA to go to one of the colleges or universities, it's not really adequate. But here's my problem. In the course of this conversation, we've seen, okay, well, this is a government responsibility over here, and this is a government responsibility over here. And at that level, it's going to be dealt with this way. And so that becomes self-fulfilling in terms of a failing prophecy.
Yeah, but I think there are three factors that are driving this. Number one is that since the pandemic, grocery prices are up 22%. And it continues to rise on the inflation rate, even when the rest of the country is feeling less of the pressure from inflation. The second is the latest statistics showing insolvencies of individuals is through the roof. I mean, people who are renewing their mortgages or, have got caught out in the last couple of years, that's a major impact for them. And we're seeing the results of that. But I think the other one is immigration. I mean, if you take that chart, you lay it over Sean Fraser, who was the immigration minister, up to Mark Miller, who's trying to cut back, you see a direct correlation. You can't just dump 1 million people into a country and say, good luck and expect the municipalities to absorb all of these sort of things. We have the report out in the last 24 hours shows that at least 15,000 international students are claiming asylum. And they're living in conditions which, I wouldn't wish anybody to live in. So, I mean, I'm not pushing this on immigrants, but what I am saying is the federal government made some decisions, and even the colleges within the province of Ontario, to attract all kinds of international students and open the doors to immigration wide open, that have put a burden on the social housing and in support system within our society that is now dealing with it. And I'm not sure it's going to end anytime soon. So, do the overlay that you can't add these many people into a country without support and expect us not to be paying a price at that end.
Yeah, Keith, I mean, who didn't see that coming? Well, the feds didn't see that coming because they got warned at all turns in terms of how this was going to play out. So there's an inadequacy there. But right now, how do we get anything out of the feds to manage this problem?
Well, is there no level of shame, quite frankly? I mean, this is what we really, and I don't mean just politicians. I think all of us need to be ashamed that many people went to a food bank in Toronto, and we know in every other community pretty much the ratios are the same, and it's spiked a lot. And it's because of, John's just pointed out, the rate of inflation. Yes, all the immigrants come in, that did not help, and they're relying on the food banks too. But the whole inflation issue, the fact that, as John pointed out, food prices are up 22% and the rate of inflation is coming down. Well, not for the working poor. I mean, that just means the rate of increase, but the inflated prices didn't come down. Maybe gasoline prices have come down a little bit, but overall, when you go to the grocery store, it's shocking every time you come out of there. I mean, it's just, you get so little for your money. And so as we see an awful lot of people, and we're talking the working poor here, we're not talking people that don't have jobs, although I'm sure they're relying on the food bank as well. But an awful lot of people, we pointed out, have 2 or even 3 jobs. They can't get full-time work. This is much a labor issue as well, an employment issue. These companies are making huge profits. They're getting away with very little taxes, and yet no one is supporting a basic income for people so that the people who are actually working for them don't need to rely on a food bank, don't need to rely on a second or a third job just to make ends meet. It's ridiculous what companies are able to get away with right now when we see, as I say, no sense of shame. the federal government clearly is responsible for a lot of what has happened here with the mass immigration that came in too quickly without support services. So they need to pony up, or they could clearly pony up with a basic income, much like they did during COVID. I mean, they didn't call it that, but it was a basic income project, and it was more generous than the one Premier Wynne had set up in Ontario. And it solved a lot of problems for a lot of people during the pandemic. They were able to feed themselves and heat their houses. People, they're making ridiculous choices now simply because they don't have enough of an income, even if they are working. That can be addressed. There should be, as I say, the corporation should have to really, the minimum wage is one thing, but it needs to be stepped up so much more. There needs to be cost of living adjustments in so many areas, and there just aren't unless companies are forced to do it. But the federal government as well, and I think the province could help out, but the federal government is responsible in a large part and needs to come up with some serious money for a basic income project right now, just to help people. And if we can get those people out of the food banks, maybe we can then turn and get some more money for the people in the homeless encampments who, to Tim's point, surely are not filing tax returns and are not getting benefits that they absolutely are probably entitled to.
Dave, can I just comment on what Keith's saying? Because I think, I mean, he, rightly, I think, identifies that, yes, we can talk about immigration, we can talk about students and all of these things that are additive to the problem. But, I remember hearing Gerard Kennedy, I guess it was in the 70s or the early 80s, when he became the head of the Daily Bread Food Bank. And I can remember him talking about, it being a job that he wanted to work himself out of, that it wasn't something, food banks were not something that we wanted to see institutionalized. But that's exactly what has happened. And so, yes, there are many, many, many people who are worse off because of those conditions that we're talking about right now. But already the existence of food banks had been institutionalized in this country. And that is the problem, because even if the federal government steps in and deals with the immigration issues, and yes, Tim, we need to increase housing, that absolutely is true. But do all of that, and there still is a large segment of the population that cannot feed themselves. And we know that because before we had all these crises, that was the case. So I think we need a more systemic solution.
A couple of the numbers that jumped out when I talked to Neil this week, and I don't think this one was in the report, but he said an unknown cost that's adding to the poverty situation in Toronto is congestion on the roads. The ability to actually deliver the food. And he said they have had to buy 2 new trucks. It's the capital cost is like close to $400,000 in terms of the vehicles that they had to buy. And then there's something like maintenance is up around $300 a year. So you add that into like these unseen costs, and it's easy to say, call to action, donate to the food bank, volunteer at the food banks, write a letter to your MPP, MP, city councilor, mayor, whatever it might be. They are now spending $29 million on groceries at the Daily Bread Food Bank annually. $29 million. Now, we could leave half the bike lanes in place in Toronto and pay that off without spending $48 million to reconstruct them. And I say that, I don't want to get into the bike lane thing, but it's about priorities, right? So I'm not sure how or where we make this more of a priority, or where's the political gain in making that call, Tim? Where's the political gain in having the courage to step up and, we've pretty much solved the problem here. We've all talked our way through major solutions right now.
Yeah, there are a tremendous number of solutions on the table, and I think fundamentally you need to get at the problem that's driving this. That's around the cost of living, the lack of housing, and limited economic opportunities. Especially when you fall off the ladder, trying to climb back up is extremely difficult, if not paralyzing, across the board. I think he does a very good job of calling on the various levels of government to take action. Because the problems are so widespread and combined, and even your point, the transportation woes are driving up costs or limiting access to groceries. There's not a simple, one person in charge try to get it done. I commend the food bank for actually laying out some simple to understand ideas you could start out with to start climbing out of this mess.
Yeah, and again, I refer to Neil as the most optimistic human being on the planet, given the challenges that he faces every day and trying to make sure that all of this stays front and center. So anyway, we'll watch it with interest to see where it goes. But, this is not sustainable. They're going to get to a point where the food banks themselves kind of collapse in on themselves just because of the pressure. So is that what it's going to take for the governments to sort of step up and say, okay, if you can't do it, yes, it's an institutional foundation now in our economy, but if it collapses, Kathleen,
I know
we're hooped.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And it's to Keith's point, it's to our shame that we've allowed that to happen. And there are hospitals in the city of Toronto who are trying to rearrange the way they deal in their emergency rooms with people who are there on a regular basis, right?
Yeah.
Because they've got nowhere to be, they need support. I mean, it is absolutely widespread and without government intervention. And as you say, there are a bunch of things we talked about this morning. It's just not going to get better. It's not going to be fixed.
In the wake of the election, of course, we talked a little bit about this last week vis-a-vis the Trump re-election 2.0. The focus on the revisitation to the free trade, John, was front and center. And boy, the premier came out swinging this week, taking a shot at Mexico specifically and suggesting that, maybe even if we're going to rethink the free trade, let's get back to it being a fair deal and it not including Mexico, because they're pretty much a backdoor for all of the stuff that's being fed into the economy from China.
You look at Mexico, they're importing cheap products, undercutting our hardworking men and women, not only here, but in the U.S. from China. They're slapping a Made in Mexico sticker on and shipping it up and taking our hardworking men and women jobs away from them. Unacceptable.
And yeah, he's right. I mean, it being unacceptable if that's where this is going to go. But, I don't get a sense that that's going to resonate all that well in terms of the overall pitch, because Trump is going to look at that as Mexico actually becomes leverage in his conversations, broadly speaking, as far as what he wants to get out of the trade deal.
Yeah, but I think the premier was right on note if his audience were the Americans in the new Trump administration. I mean, you got to deal with this straight up, because that's part of what they're coming for. You've got to be prepared for it. Businesses have got to be prepared for it. And we can go on and on about how bad tariffs will be and drive the price up and things like that, but it's coming. And, we're going to see some changes that are significant. Even Mark Miller in the last couple of days has been talking about the safe haven rules that are affected in the United States, and people want to cross the borders. I mean, when you look at the appointments that the Trump administration is making, to them, these are not unreasonable demands. I mean, whether it's experience or whether it is, how they've taken some of these issues before, and you can see them in Congress and you can see them other places before they were put in their new cabinet portfolios. Man, oh man, this is really a train barreling down the track. So I think that the premier was prudent in how he addressed this. The question now is, how do you negotiate it? How do you, those relationships as I think Premier Wynne said last week when we were talking about this, the relationships cross-border and visiting with the other legislatures and the governors are really, really important for Canada at this stage. So we can't be left out in any way, shape, or form of the debate. And I think he jumped into it at the right time.
Yeah, Keith, it's a matter of, we've said politically before, don't let somebody else define you. I think that was pretty much the exercise going on here.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think Donald Trump has yet seen this missive from Doug Ford come across his desk. I think he's got other things in his mind this week. But officials in Washington certainly saw it. Officials in Ottawa certainly saw it. And that's what he's really trying to get through, is get to the Trudeau government. Let's make a deal here, and let's not get hung up in the whole NAFTA thing. We both know Mexico is not acting the same way Canada and the U.S. act when it comes to trade issues. The Americans slap 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. Canada follows lockstep. This is what the Americans want, and this is what Ford is saying to Donald Trump and his administration. We're here. Let's make a deal. Don't even worry about Trudeau. Canada wants to make a deal with you. We're an important trading partner. And he's right. I think politically it's very smart of him to get ahead of this and just emphasize this message to Ontarians and to everyone else across Canada and in the United States that This is something we need to deal with this administration. We have to be prepared to deal with them on a business to business level. And the first thing we can do is to signal to them that we don't view Mexico as an equal to the rest of us, the Canada and the United States when it comes to trade issues. Why should we treat them as an equal? Let's make our own bilateral deal. I think politically it's very smart for Ford to do this.
Tim, what's the possibility that rewriting it means writing them out?
I think it's effective positioning. I think ultimately you want to have, all three parts there as part of a, North American trade approach, and then hopefully expand. So let me get back to two things, the economics, and I'll come back to the politics. My recollection, Dave, and my colleagues can correct me if I misremember, was in the negotiations of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement last time around, there was a bit of trading that took place. So Canada actually did gang up with the US. This was Trudeau and Trump at the time, to go after Mexico on cars because Mexico had very low-cost labor and was importing parts. So CUSMA was changed to make sure there was a guaranteed minimum wage for auto workers, which helped keep jobs here and in the US. So we combined. Mexico and Canada actually teamed up against the US and making sure there were clear rules around solving disputes. So mission accomplished there. We'll see those under attack. So my point being that on the economics here, it is pretty common for the countries to try to find areas where they have a common interest and go after the third. On the politics side, I think this is very good positioning by Premier Ford for two respects. Number one of his priorities has been around next generation automobiles, EVs, right, batteries, and that's big part of his economic plan. So positioned solidly there. Second point is, I think he'll actually drag the Trudeau government in this direction as well, to make sure, I think, that all three countries are involved, but that Mexico will have to stop importing the cheap Chinese goods. You've seen the National Liberal Party, which has been the most successful political party in the Western world, slowly shifting its position to the right on issues like immigration, cost of living, and I bet they'll embrace this one as well.
Kathleen, when you look at that, though, and it's easy to say we want to have a partnership and collaboration, et cetera, but this is every man for himself, essentially. And even to the subtleties around how we refer to the trade agreement. Here in Canada, we put the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. In Washington, it's the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. So, it's subtle, but it kind of makes the point.
Yeah, but yes, and I think Tim, I think Tim's absolutely right though that this is positioning for the premier. I think it's smart in terms of sending a message to our American partners, and I'm quite sure that there are officials in government provincially who have been talking with federal officials who are talking to American officials. This isn't. It probably didn't come out of the blue that the premier said this. But I also think that we need to listen. We need to listen to people like Flavio Volpe, the head of the Auto Parts Association, because it's guys like that who understand the integration of the supply chain and what's possible and how we're going to actually enter a negotiation. Because as Tim said, there are going to be trade-offs. And Trump his opening position is going to be blow everything up. I mean, that's what he's saying. That's what he's trying to do. And maybe that's what will happen. But I don't know what that looks like, because there are so many people in his country who are dependent on that relationship. And that's the tricky negotiation now that Canada and Ontario have to enter into. So I think that Ford is, he's hanging out this kind of shingle that says we're willing to go it alone with you, America, and that's going to be appealing to some of the folks in the States. But at the end of the day, it is a North American reality that we've been in this relationship for decades now, and so we need to figure out how we do it without exploding people's lives. It's not to our advantage in Canada or to the advantage of people in the United States that Mexico be cut loose completely and that they are, they have millions of families who are destitute. That's not going to help us. So how do we navigate this over the next couple of years, so that yeah, we can protect what we want to protect, because things like supply management for our dairy and poultry industries are going to be right in the crosshairs. They already are, of the United States, and that's a huge political issue for us as a country. So all of that comes into play. But I think I think that coming out saying this now is probably a smart political move.
And can I add to that, Dave?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, we can't forget too, right? That, I mean, Mexico's population is about 128 million people. So, 3 times the size of Canada. And while we're the 10th largest economy, they're 15th, right? So that's a consequential market you still want to have trading access to, and a growing economy. So I think it's an effective negotiation to threaten dropping them from the deal, to get them to relinquish, what they're doing with China. But ultimately, hopefully, you keep that North American pact together.
The other thing I want to add to this is that there's going to be a huge regime change in Ottawa. I mean, there's no way that the Liberals are going to recover from where they are. I mean, if you look across the country right now, given the current voting and the seat modeling, they're down to 12 seats, the Liberals in Ontario. 12 seats. I mean, the impact of this is going to be, and we've heard, the signals starting to come back and forth between the Poilievre camp and the White House, and some of the policies that they are going to start to craft. This new deal is going to be negotiated by a very different political party with a very different mindset. I don't know whether it's going to align entirely with what's south of the border, but how we've approached these things before, whether it be on supply management or how we've dealt with the issues previously in the negotiations with a Trump government or not, maybe a very different circumstance. When you think that, January 6th is going to come, the transfer of power, there's going to be, years, many months before a negotiated settlement is done. Man, oh man, I think we better buckle up and be prepared for what's to come.
But Keith, there was the day when we all covered the first free trade agreement, and and Prime Minister Mulroney was driving that hard, and we kind of just let it sit. And I think culturally, it felt like it was just percolating in the background. We're now at a stage where what's baked into the North America free trade as it stands now is this regular review. It's being positioned as if Trump wants to tear it up. It's actually part of the deal that they would go back and revisit and review it. So this shouldn't be viewed as a crisis. It should be viewed, I think, as opportunity. And in fact, maybe it's a more robust structure, in as much as it allows us to respond more regularly to changing political cultures, whatever the affordability, whatever the issues might be in terms of markets, AI, all of these things that are scary and on the horizon. This might be more of an opportunity than we're letting on.
Well, it's a scheduled opportunity. It's a scheduled review in 2026 of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, and of course we're all in a negotiating position at this point. But that's the advantage of it. The clear benefit of the agreement, and I think Kim alluded to it earlier, was a dispute resolution mechanism. That's so important. If 3 countries going to deal with these things, Canada's got a hard case defending our marketing card system. The Americans really hate that, and they do want to blow it up. But I think that's what we're hearing about Trump, wanting to tear up the agreement. Well, he wants to tear up all the agreements and start everything from a new deal. So I don't think that's a huge surprise or a big concern. I think, as you say, it's an opportunity for Canada and for Mexico to negotiate with the Americans to see what we can actually get to benefit all 3 economies, and to keep access going between those 3 economies to everything from cars to every other thing we can trade with each other. So I think this is just smart politicking at this point. And it is, as you say, an opportunity. It's nothing to get alarmed about at this point, especially, getting alarmed at Donald Trump's language. We could be alarmed every single day, 3 times a day if we wanted to. Let's just see what actually happens in the negotiations.
One of the things that popped up this week, and I think it was probably a bit overdue, but I think it was smart politics on many levels, was Bonnie Crombie standing up and talking about her tax cuts. And she did it against the backdrop of the $200 checks that the Ford government is planning to cut for everybody across the province.
Doug Ford thinks a one-time $200 check makes up for the cost of living crisis that he created. Well, I disagree. So today I'm here to announce that when I'm Premier, I'm going to stop the giveaways to Doug's friends and cut your taxes instead. As Premier, I'll immediately do two things to put more money back into your pockets. First, I'll cut your income taxes. And then I'll get rid of the sales tax on home heating and hydro bills.
So that must resonate with you, Tim. We're cutting taxes. That's all good. And it makes life more affordable. And it's an annual thing. It's not just sort of a one-shot flash in the pan, in terms of putting money back in people's pockets. And I think politically it was a smart thing to do that quickly after the rebate conversation, because his willingness to hand out $200 checks gave Crombie license to do this, to step out and actually make that point.
So, music to my ears. Income tax reductions, talked about last show, relief on the home heating and hydro bills. I just didn't like the not for Doug's friends. So I still hope I get it. She was the policy into place. It's funny too. Those were policies that were part of my platform. Income tax reductions, and I had talked about taking the HST off heat and hydro. So I know that they do resonate. Okay, back to the question. Had been good for Bonnie Crombie and putting an idea on the table that I think makes sense economically. I think it's important for Liberals to shift to be on the stronger side of the affordability issues. And third, it's understandable to average folks. Income tax cuts, they may not see exactly what that means to them, but certainly we all see what our heating and hydro bills look like. So you get some relief there. That's always the challenge, when your opposition leader, is to figure out your timing when you make those types of commitments, because you're making them for some time down the road. You don't know when the dynamic shifts or options are eliminated. You don't know if the government steals your plan. But I think the timing was right here. She's connected with a policy that will resonate, that hits with affordability. And if there is an election in spring of 2025, she's laid out a strong plank.
Kathleen, there was some harping about, how are you going to pay for that tax cut? You're costing it out. And on the other hand, immediately people were pointing a finger at, Doug Ford and saying, well, hell, you're just spending the money, you're driving up the deficit again. But you can't have it both ways. So either you complain about Doug Ford not costing out his tax cuts and the, increasing the deficit, or you shut up about it and you just let them both carry on and do what they want to do and not be accountable for it.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things going on here, and I think Tim's right. I think that she was putting forward a rational economic plank in her platform, and I think that it makes a lot of sense. And she's defining herself because a lot of people don't know her yet. She's defining herself as someone who is going to come up with plans that make sense, that are based on some evidence, unlike a populist $200 check that may feel good in the short term, but actually doesn't do anything in the long term. So I think it was a good juxtaposition against what Ford is doing. And, it's something Ford said he was going to do. That's the other aspect of this. He said he was going to do a tax cut. He hasn't. And so I think that was an added sort of benefit to her coming out with this at this point. And obviously people are looking for initiatives that are going to help them save money. That's the number one issue for people right now. So I think it was smart timing.
Yeah, John, the timing of it was smart. I think the language around it is smart. And back to Tim's point though about Doug's friends, I think that's a losing rant now. I think it's so baked into whoever's not going to vote for Ford that it's just put it aside. Those folks who think that Doug is actually paying off his buddies are already not on Team Doug. Now you're probably better to let that rest and then have what she has just talked about, those kitchen table issues resonating with folks who are now going to turn around and pay attention.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think you can have both, and I think you should have both. The record of the Ford government is going to be on display in any campaign. So what we've got here is two things. Number one, we've got, for the first time, instead of having her wagon painted, Bonnie Crombie painted just a little bit and taken a little bit of it back, right? She's now wedged into when all those commercials said, she's going to raise her taxes. She's now at the platform saying, nope, going to cut him. He's lying. She's opened that part. Secondly, there will be a constituency out there, and she has to fight against the NDP as well, that will basically say, hey, look at Therma, look at the Green Bank, look at X, Y, and Z. She's going to say that's where, in fact, he's associated with his cronies. Let's remember far back that there was a time when even Bill Davis, before he became Brampton Billy, was characterized as riding around in the back of a big limousine, smoking a big stogie and looking after his friends. I mean, it's a common thing that you're going to be able to use against your opponents. She slipped it in because in the campaign that's to come, it's going to be part of the narrative in the window. So I think, I think it was probably prudent that she threw it in right now from a tactical point of view.
Keith?
Agree completely. I mean, if we look again to the U.S. election, what did Trump say? That he's going to basically give, I'm not going to tax your overtime. I'm not going to tax your tips. And what did the Democrats say? He's a threat to democracy. Well, what's resonating with people? So she's come out here saying, Doug Ford broke his promise to cut your income taxes. I'm going to do it. Here's when I'm going to do it. Right off the bat, I think, as we said, she takes back that issue. And it's probably the biggest recognition she's going to get on her own without, as you say, the Tories have defined her up until this point with their commercials. So this is, I think, probably the biggest announcement she's going to have and get the most attention. And this will resonate with people. So I think it's smart from that point of view. I also think that the Liberals in the legislature have adopted a new smart tactic that I want to give them credit for as well. And that's basically every question that they get now, they're raising it to say, this riding or minister in your riding, there's 25,000 people without a family doctor. Then the next question, same thing in your riding, there's 18,000 people without a family. That's how this kind of stuff is going to hit home. So that's a smart legislative strategy in question period. And this one getting Bonnie Crombie out with a tax cut when she's been labeled as the carbon tax queen. She comes right out and says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut your tax. First thing I'm saying to you, I'm going to cut your taxes. Something Doug Ford promised and didn't do. Very smart politically. Timing was perfect. And again, I think, as I say, you look at, Trump's simple message is just, I'm not going to tax your overtime or your tips. That really helped in a couple of really important states. It's just a basic message for people, and we've discussed it all through this show. People are afraid to go to the grocery store. They can't afford to eat. It goes right to on message is what people want to hear right now.
So let me just, I think we're all on the same page vis-a-vis it was smart. The timing was right. But let me just suggest that post that news conference, there was next to zero buzz I heard about this story, with the exception of the people who are, diving deep into the wonk swamp there.
She's going to have to announce it 10 times. I remember Dalton McGuinty used to say to me, you got to tell them what you're going to tell them, then you got to tell it to them, then you got to tell them what you told them. And you keep doing it over and over and over again. So it's going to take some time to have some impact for sure. But I say, this one will get attention.
And she's laying a foundation, Dave. She's laying a foundation. The press are not paying much attention to Bonnie at this point. I mean, the fact that even this broke through, I think, says that it was a good move. But they're still more interested in, and they are paying more attention to Ford, and there's Trump and all of it. So she has to do this. And she has to lay that foundation that then, as you get closer to an election, and who knows when that's going to be, it may be in 10 minutes, she'll be able to be much more in the spotlight.
Yeah, it's a lot like the Three Bears and Goldilocks, right? The premier's got the big microphone. There's a medium-sized microphone. And when you're, third party, you have a very small microphone. So I thought she actually got really good volume for what you tend to get. I think the only risk here, Dave, is if the election is in 2026 as opposed to 2025 as scheduled, you're limiting your options, right? You're going to have a sort of a full platform that has the trade-offs between revenue reductions and spending increases. But if the election is 2025, I think she timed it very well.
John?
Well, you know what? The biggest problem in this country is lack of investment and productivity. And I got to say that when you're looking now at $1.40 versus the greenback south of the border, I mean, somebody's got to be paying attention to this. So, I mean, the reality is that if the new conservative government gets in, capital gains taxes will probably be sliced. There'll be a whole lot of other new policies put in place. I think she's actually on the right track even for 2026. She's managed to wedge in the one thing that she was getting hammered about in every fundraising letter, every commercial, everything. And that is something in a plank about an economic policy to affect individuals. And I think that's got to broaden into a bigger fiscal circumstance for a platform. But I think it leaves it open for her to even talk about cuts in capital gains and other issues here. So I think she's got runway now, and I think it was the right time to do it.
Well, let's suggest that we're out of runway this week. So we'll leave it there. And Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, John Wright, Keith Leslie, thank you all. It's always great to have the folks around the table. And again, just a reminder that we are going to be inviting you to be part of the show, that is. So join us through the talkback message. The link is in the show notes. It's speakpipe.com/ontheledge. And we would love to hear what you have to say about the show. And of course, those of you who are commenting on the various platforms, continue to do so. If you aren't already following the show, make sure you do, because there'll be notifications that'll drop into your email, and you'll know exactly when the various bits of content pop up on YouTube, on Apple, Spotify, etc. All right, that'll do it for me. I'm Dave Trafford. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario politics podcast for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.